hope and despair, economic miracle and collapse, democratic resurgence and slide toward totalitarianism. These are words that hold true to Japan during the years 1918 to 1940, and they were especially so for the socialists and workers' movement who would go from a small speck in Japan's society in 1918 to a major force to be reckoned with 10 years later, but unfortunately be completely crushed by 1940. This is the story of these two movements during the interwar period. By 1917, the Japanese labor movement was more or less destroyed, with strikes and agitations completely outlawed. Socialist movements had fared even worse, its radical members such as Katayama Sen or Kotoku Shuiso having been either forced into exile or executed. More moderate socialists such as Abe Iso could remain, but the state remained ever vigilant. However, beginning in 1918 and continuing into the 20s and 30s, the situation in Japan would completely change and allow for an explosion in both movements. What was it then in 1918 that happened which completely changed Japan? The answer? Rice. Or more specifically, the price of rice. In that late summer, Japan experienced an, even to this day, unprecedented popular uprising against the immense price increases. These rice riots would not simply be localized to a few prefectures, no. They would break out from Hokkaido in the north to Kyushu in the south, with workers in urban areas, rural fishing communities and farmers all partaking. So, what were the causes for this upheaval in Japan? While yes, you could end this by simply saying expensive rice and be done with it and jump to the events and its consequences. I will not do this, however. For one, that would be a very black and white description, and two, you would miss out on me going in depth on events which I find fascinating for several minutes. And what a shame that would be. So, the story. In 1918, the First World War had caused immense economic growth for Japan. However, this prosperity still had not permeated into the greater populace, and large swaths still lingered in poverty. The booming wartime economy seemingly only created wealth for certain Japanese businessmen. But the problem wasn't just a wealthier bourgeoisie, no, it was that the average Japanese grew poorer. The war years would see a real wage drop by a whopping 30%. Furthermore, even the middle class felt the impact of the price increases. As Lewis mentions in Rioters and Citizens, purchasing power of lower government officials had been halved by 1918. Oh, and just a quick mention, most of this segment will draw heavily on this book. Neither was it only the lower classes who begrudged these lucky few. The traditional elite had also disdainfully dubbed these wealthy upstarts narikin, a term deriving from the chess move where a pawn transforms into another piece. It was clear that resentment existed in all parts of society. This is part of the explanation for why these riots were so massive. Additionally, the government, under the non-party Prime Minister and Field Marshal Terauchi Masatake, themselves had inadvertently spurred on anger as they allowed an open discussion of the massive economic gains, perhaps to foster a feeling of how great the nation was becoming, but which instead had the opposite effect. This is not the only way the actions of the state led to these riots. The state was fully aware of the mounting problems of ever-increasing prices of rice. Yet, when they acted by trying to stamp out market speculators, the government did so in the incorrect belief that the cause lay in speculation and not in the actual fact that there was simply not enough rice to feed the country. The unfortunate result of this was that the policies either had zero effect at all or even made the situation worse. The fault of the government cannot either, and should not, purely be labeled as gross incompetence. More often than not, the inaction was deliberate because, for one, much of the government, even the parties in opposition, scarcely held the belief that policy should be dictated by the will of the people, but instead that the people should follow the will of policy. Additionally, the extremely limited voting, based on wealth and land ownership, also meant that those elected officials actually were accountable to were simply those who profited from the immense price and low wages. So, wartime inflation, government action and inaction, and fears about further scarcity of rice in the eventual case Japan intervened in Siberia against the Bolsheviks had therefore resulted in an almost 45% increase in the price of rice over less than a year. And the people of Japan could no longer handle the situation. On the 22nd of July then, in Toyama Prefecture, Wives of fishermen were discontent with dealing with such high prices, even though there clearly was no local shortage of rice. And in turn began non-violent actions such as obstructing the loading of rice onto transport ships. Sugimura Hatsu, a woman in her 20s, would later describe 3 of the leaders who were over 50 as, quote, being able to outwork men at loading grain. They also attempted to persuade male workers to follow their example. When verbal persuasion failed, these tough women prevented men from proceeding with their work. Japanese obasan's at their weakest, am I right? Actions so far had not been enough, failing to elicit any change, and crowds of angry people grew ever larger. And soon they began demanding, not appealing, to local officials and rice merchants to halt all rice shipments. For example, on the 7th, in Namerikawa, a crowd of 2,000 men and women went to the mansion of Kanagawa, an owner of a rice shipping company, to demand the cessation of grain shipments, to which his clerk responded, quote, we aren't doing anything wrong by buying and selling rice. Generally speaking, if you people have so much time to come down here and make trouble, shouldn't you put your energy into side work? That would be good for you. Yikes, truly channeling that Marie Antoinette there. Still, the actions in Toyama remained quite peaceful and can hardly be called riots. However, the news of the events there spread far and wide across the land, and were often over-exaggerated by the press into seeming something much bigger and unruly. Others were therefore inspired by what they had read and heard, and actual riots soon spread. First to Okayama, and soon on the 9th to Nagoya. By the 11th, Osaka, Kobe, Hiroshima and Kure were also being rocked by riots, and on the following day Tokyo was embroiled. By the 20th, nearly 40 cities throughout most of Japan had seen riots. In Nagoya, where riots occurred for more than a week, perhaps as many as 50,000 people showed up to protest on a single day, and police reports suggest that almost a third of the city's 437,000 inhabitants were possibly involved in the riots. In Osaka, they were even larger. Estimations surmise the total number at 232,000. The actions taken in the city were drastically different from Toyama. Not only was there large destruction of property, riots often forced rice sellers under duress to either sell at reduced prices or give rice away. Furthermore, violence was also directed toward police. For while in Toyama the police had acted as mediators, in the cities they were instead viewed with great ire as protecting the corrupt rice traders. Beside the higher degree of violence, the urban rioters were also much more politically conscious. Therefore, their demands were also being leveled at the Terauchi cabinet itself, and they demanded not only his resignation, but also increased voting rights. For as they saw it, in a modern state of people, the people had a right to partake in decision-making. The riots would also spread from the cities back to the countryside. However, these rural protests where farming rather than fishing were the main staple, were not about returning to the status quo prior to the extraordinary prices, which was the case in Toyama, but to further free themselves from the traditional influence of the land-owning elite. Unlike the city riots though, these were not about national politics but local issues. Different from the other 3 areas in both cause and sequence of events was mining. Here, the actions and demands instead resembled classical labor strikes, and as a result, the rioting in the major coal mines in southwestern Honshu and northern Kyushu were mainly localized to the workplace, where they targeted the managers and directors of the mines. The events spiraling out of control and spreading far and wide stirred much anxiety in the government. Not only were these unprecedented civil uprisings, to the government's great fear, those partaking in riots also included members of state-sponsored youth organizations and, most terrifyingly, army reservists. Remember, this is just a few months since the Russian Revolution. There, part of the armed forces had aided in putting an end to the absolute monarchy. In a hurried response, the Terauchi government therefore began implementing a stick and carrot policy by forcing rice to be sold at lower prices and giving out monetary support to those in need, and, on the other hand, would mobilize over 100,000 troops to swiftly quell the rioting. And these soldiers were not adverse to the use of violence, as one witness later retold of a riot in Kobe on the 13th of August, quote, "Finally, at around 11 that night, bugles blared the arrival of a support group of 2 platoons. The basic strategy of these fresh troops was to drive pockets of stone-throwing rioters from side streets. To do this, the soldiers fixed bayonets, divided into 4 groups, and set in place a machine gun. Then they began the attack. I was lying in a ditch from where I could see the assault repeated several times. After the crowd fled, wooden sandals and hats lay scattered like leaves blown in the wind. But when the crowd realized that the machine guns fired only blanks, they rallied and returned, throwing sandals and rocks. The machine gun may have fired blanks, but the bayonets were real enough. A man, slashed in the thigh, fell into my ditch. My white suit, already covered with mud, was now wet with blood." End quote. These actions would continue across the country until late October, by which all rioting had been dealt with. The Terauchi cabinet, however, could not survive the fallout, and by the 29th of September was forced to resign, and was replaced by Hara Takashi, the first commoner to ever hold the post of Japanese prime minister. The new cabinet meant no effective change though, as Hara would continue the brutal policy of near martial law, quickly arresting about 25,000 people, out of which close to 9,000 were charged, out of which 2 received the death penalty. During these trials, a common goal for government officials was to find out if rioters belonged to a socialist or anarchist ideology. As one miner later recalled, quote, "It was a real kangaroo court. They called us socialists and treated us like socialists, always threatening and bullying. We didn't know a single thing about socialists or socialism. After the initial interrogation, we were taken to the prosecutors for a preliminary hearing. It was just the same, total nonsense." The fervent anti-socialism of the Japanese political elite had caused them to assume, incorrectly, that the riots were caused by so-called dangerous thinkers on the left. As rioting was unfolding, the government rushed to further clamp down on the already thoroughly oppressed left by quickly detaining known left-wing and labor thinkers and agitators without any cause. But, to the government's chagrin, leftist ideas were a minuscule part of rioting. The actual truth is that rioting lacked any cohesive ideological basis. City folk pushed a pro-democracy agenda on top of economic woes, while in Toyama, the previously mentioned owner of a rice shipping company, Kanagawa, was an ardent supporter of universal suffrage, and one who spoke in support of him at the time was none other than a local socialist who, somewhat correctly, blamed the Japanese intervention in Siberia as a bigger cause than local merchants. But if one is to find one coherent part of the rioting, it is that they were somewhat ubiquitously Japanese, especially the rural ones. Rioters often held to a set conduct, they would only resort to violent acts on property in case relief was not given after clear demands, and rural riots almost never stole rice but forced prices down to a fair level. The rioting would have 3 pivotal impacts on Japan. 1. They forced the government and the elite to begin not only social, but importantly political reforms, which by 1925 emanated in universal suffrage. And 2. The civil unrest had given a first taste of politics for individuals who previously had 0 experience, something that would galvanize a generation of younger people to begin a political career. For example, Nishio Suehiro would be one of the people who began their career after the rice riots and would, after World War II, become Vice Prime Minister of Japan. And lastly, many trade unions, such as the Yoikai, under the leadership of Suzuki Bunji, would finally emerge from their pre-war near erasure to once again find support among discontent workers. So, why have I gone on and on for almost X amount of minutes discussing these riots? Some of these topics are self-explanatory. However, some are not, such as why I go in depth on the acts in Toyama. Had I simply mentioned the events in the cities and the mining industry, the nuance of the rice riots would have been lost, and many would have assumed they really were an outburst of a crisis of capitalism, as sometimes both thinkers then and historians now do. They really weren't, but rather a mixture of traditional unrest and modern political violence, which, if considering Japan at the time, it's perfectly understandable. Remember that in 1918 there would have been people alive who were born prior to the forced opening of the nation and spread of Western ideas. So, with all that behind us, let's jump headfirst into the labor and socialist movement. Besides rioting, the years 1918 and 1919 would also witness a large number of strikes, involving 66,457 and 63,137 workers respectively. The labor movement quickly capitalized on the popular resentment and began to send members and agitators far and wide in the hopes of building unions. The Yoikai, soon renamed the Sodomei, an organization which had survived the prior years by promoting harmony in the workplace, would be one of the principal agents as the events of 1918 would radically transform the group, to where it not only accepted strikes as legitimate, the most decisive change was by turning socialist with their pledge to rid the world of the evils of capitalism. By the end of 1990, its efforts had proven themselves, as membership had grown to more than 30,000, roughly a third of the total National Union membership. Beside the traditional labor agitators, other parts of society took a greater interest in rising workers' animosity. For one, several Kensikai members, the opposition party to Hara's Seijukai cabinet, a party which turned increasingly liberal after 1918, began fostering unions, partaking in the formation of 211 unions in 1919 alone. Stunningly, part of the capitalist class themselves began realizing the situation was turning against them. For example, the Saibatsu, the big conglomerates, began implementing company welfare programs to reduce the allure of unions. All this pressure forced Hara to act and try to find a solution. Responsibility would fall on Home Minister Tokonami Takejiro, who swiftly acted by reinterpreting the anti-union Article 17 of the police law by arguing that the law disallowed instigation or incitement in a strike or in the formation of a union by outsiders, not the strike itself, nor the internal organization of union by peaceful means. As a result, arrest by this law would decline. Furthermore, he engineered the Kyoshokai, a body whose main role was to mediate workplace disputes. To the great joy of the Sodomei, the government had also, at the Treaty of Versailles, joined the International Labour Organization, or ILO, in which membership required a pledge to guarantee the right to organize trade unions. Hara's cabinet, therefore, had to form a committee to finally resolve the issue of unions. This would cause quite the chaos, as Tokonami had one idea of state-controlled and directed factory work councils, while Nambara, a young Home Ministry official, would lay forth another proposal, and the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce publish a third. With Nambara's being the most radical with complete legality for unions, still, the fact remains that three competing ideas from different parts of the bureaucracy floated around. So, as Sheldon Garon mentions, quote, to diffuse the controversy over which ministry represented the government on labor policy, Prime Minister Hara submitted the dispute to the newly created Extraordinary Commission to Investigate Industry. To the complete bewilderment of the press, Home Ministry leaders shifted 180 degrees in the course of the Commission's deliberations. Sometime during the first meetings in late March, Home Minister Tokonami backed away from his work council proposal and substituted Nambara's progressive draft as the Home Minister's own labor bill. Additionally, the Kensikai had in a stunning turn put the legal recognition of unions at the forefront of its policy program together with universal suffrage. It was a confusing mess, and no decision was yet taken. But the Kensikai's shift soon earned them the support of the Sodomei, who in turn put suffrage as one of their top priorities. As this unity of suffrage and labor movement emerged, labor disputes didn't cool down, but instead their flames were fanned as Hara decided to dissolve the National Diet on the 26th of February 1920 in order to halt a possible opposition Kensikai and Kokuminto alliance from proposing a new universal suffrage bill. The following election, extremely fraudulent with mass gerrymandering, led to a Seijukai majority, Hara's party, and all further discussion of voting rights was shut down. Smelling blood, radical syndicalists and anarchists soon joined in the union struggle and pointed at this to argue that cooperation with the state was for naught and that only aggressive action would achieve change. As an extra bonus, the radical left saw further opportunity as a recession hit the country in the years following the First World War, leaving more than 200,000 workers unemployed. The appeal and growth of anarchism grew problematic, not only for the state, but also for the Sodomei, who opposed the reckless militancy of the anarchists. Such rising inter-leftist tension is highlighted at the 1920 Sodomei Convention, which quickly became a clash between anarchists and social democratic ideas, where anarchists on one side argued for an all-out labor offensive, and on the other side were social democrats such as Nishio Soehiro, who countered the anarchist rejection of parliamentarism by arguing that, quote, to reject parliamentarism but to debate this problem is in itself an undeniable contradiction, for the essence of parliamentarism was the freedom of debate. In order to drive out the anarchists, in 1922 the Social Democratic part of the Sodomei turned to an unlikely ally, the communists. Something which one day would come back to bite the labor organization. Still, even with their pro-parliamentary stance, the Sodomite didn't renounce militancy in labor. Most evidence is seen in their support of the largest strike during the interwar period, when, in mid-1921, over 35,000 workers began striking at the Mitsubishi and Kawasaki shipyards in Kobe. Strikes that once again forced the government to deploy troops, resulting in arrests of several hundred strike leaders and violent clashes leading to at least one death and several injured. While the strikes failed, they forced the heavy industry Zaibatsus to acquiesce to demands for better conditions and wages. The strike would, however, signify the beginning of the end in union activity in the heavy industry, as the Zaibatsus would give just enough to stop left-wing unions. And later on, play with fire by supporting the rise of ultra-nationalist right-wing unions, such as the Jikyokai, whose anti-capitalist rhetoric could have turned dire for the conglomerates in the 30s had not Japan's war of conquest in China required such a harmonious weapons industry. With the end of the shipyard strikes and the Diet firmly secured, Hara, now comfortably in power, no longer felt the urgency to introduce union legislation. Unfortunately for Hara, he would be assassinated on the 4th of November 1921. This caused further instability in Japanese politics, as the nation would see 4 different prime ministers before the 1924 elections. Not only was it the political sphere which would be shaken during the early 20s, the heart of the nation itself, Tokyo, would be shaken to its core in September 1923 as the Great Kanto earthquake and its resulting fires destroyed about 364,000 homes in the city and killed more than 100,000. In the aftermath, angry and frightened citizens began spreading rumors that a massive firestorm had been orchestrated by left-wing radicals and Korean ethnic minorities. A flurry of violence against such members would unfold as vigilante mobs, supported by police, rounded up and murdered tens of labor and socialist members and thousands of Koreans and 100 Chinese ethnic minorities, in what would soon be known as a White Terror. One victim was Osugi Sakai, the most prominent Japanese anarchist, who was murdered along with his partner and nephew, symbolizing the end of anarchism in Japan. The Sodomei had too been dealt a severe blow in Tokyo, both by the earthquake and its violent aftermath, and would need to rebuild. Yet it and the rest of the labor movement continued to grow. Nationwide membership just prior to the earthquake was still slightly more than 30,000 for the Sodomei, a quarter of the now total 125,000 organized workers. A number which would nearly double the following year to 230,000. This was not the only boon for the labor movement. The national election that same year led to a coalition government under Kensekai Premier Kato Takaki, a government which would, together with Home Ministry and our old pal from the previous video, Goto Shinpei, push for and succeed in implementing universal male suffrage in 1925. Additionally, this new government would also work much harder in implementing the 1922 health insurance law and the 1923 revision of the 1911 factory law. The Sodomei could applaud this successful political drive, which they hoped would inevitably result in the full legal recognition of unions. However, 2 things that would heavily damage the unity of the labor movement occurred in the same year. Firstly, while the Kensekai was lauded for their liberal reforms, they also pushed through the Seijukai Peace Preservation Law, which stated, quote, "Anyone who has organized an association with the objective of radically altering the national polity, kokutai o henkakushi, or denying the system of private property, or anyone who has joined such an association with full knowledge of its object shall be liable to imprisonment with or without hard labor for a term not exceeding 10 years. Any attempt to commit the crimes in the preceding clause will also be punished." The law, clearly directed at the radical left, would, as Japan turned more and more totalitarian in the 30s, be used more frequently and in increased scope, finally against the liberal Kensekai themselves. Secondly, the Sodomei would be splintered in 1925 as a large contingent of the members such as Kato Kanji and Watanabe Masanosuke felt that the close cooperation between the Sodomei and the Kensekai had resulted in an organization which was too cozy with capitalist elites, and vehemently anti-communist by supporting police detainment of members of the Communist Party of Japan, which had in 1922 illegally formed with aid from Sakai Toshihiko. Kato, Watanabe, and others therefore went on to form the Japan Council of Labor Unions, Nihon Rodo Kumiai Hyogikai, or simply Hyogikai. which would reach more than 20,000 members by the end of 1925. The hostility between the Hyogikai and the Sodomei was particularly sour, as both sides lambasted the other. The Sodomei portraying the Hyogikai as a foreign agent of the Comintern, and vice versa, the Sodomei as a weak union which would rather preserve peace than help workers. With the advent of universal suffrage on the horizon, the Japan Farmers Union, Nihon no Min Komiai, with a membership of about 70,000 mainly tenant farmers, would try to reconcile the Hyogikai and Sodomei to form a unified workers' party. However, the Sodomei flatly rejected involvement with several other invited groups due to them being too closely affiliated with communism. Therefore, the talks failed to elicit Hyogikai or Sodomei support. The Nomin trudged on to form the Farmer Labour Party, Nomin Rodoto, with the remaining members of the talks, but this party lasted a few hours before Home Ministry officials demanded its cessation. In early 1926, a new round of discussion excluded the radical Hyogikai, but instead included famed figures of the left such as Abe Iso and Takano Iwasaburo, met with success as these men could smooth out most problems, and the Labour Farmer Party, Rodoto Nomin, was formed. However, the party soon began to falter as the Sodomei rejected the idea of allowing any Hyogikai members into the party at all. And so, when the issue turned into a vote and accepted, the Sodomei soon broke its support in late October, allowing the communist Hyogikai to fill the void. It is interesting to see that the Sodomei was in some ways quite anti-democratic, but it's understandable to have wanted to distance itself from the Hyogikai with what would soon happen to them. The Sodomei, therefore, in turn, formed the Shakai Minshuto, or Social Democratic Party, on the 5th of December 1926. On the 9th, to further complicate matters, another prominent labor leader, Asao Hisashi, would himself seek to form a party ideologically in between the others two, and was therefore kicked from the Sodomei and subsequently formed another labor organization, the Japan Labor Union Alliance, Nihon Rodo Komiai Domei, henceforth Domei, with about 17,000 union members. So, to summarize, the following parties were formed. The Social Democratic Party was formed with support of Sodomei intellectuals such as Abe Iso, who, together with Suzuki Bunji, would be part of the party's first elected members. The Hyogikai would, together with the underground Communist Party, control the Labour Farmer Party. To once again complicate matters, Asao Hisashi would have the genius idea to form the Japan Labour Farmer Party. To make things even more confusing, an independent group would also form the Japan's Farmers Party. Still keeping up with the mess of Japanese interwar politics? Well done then. So, to repeat from political left to right, there was the Labour Farmer Party, the Japan Labour Farmer Party, the Social Democratic Party, and the Japan's Farmers Party. In the election in February 1928, the parties divided up about 4.7% of the popular vote to win a mere 8 seats, or 1.7% of the lower house. The Hyogikai and their associated party, however, flew too close to the sun, with their almost open communism, and would be forcefully disbanded by the government in early spring 1928, while simultaneously arresting over 1,500 suspected communists nationwide and disbanding the Japan's Farmers Union, all under the auspices of the Peace Preservation Law. While the arrest of these members were tacitly supported by both the Social Democratic Party and the Minseto, formerly Kensekai, both agreed that it went too far in its repression. As Sheldon Garon points out, quote, Egitasuke denounced the hasty, frenzied suppositions and emotions underlying the government's actions. The liberal ex-bureaucrat argued that only participatory democracy and respect for minority opinions would prevent the people from turning to radical ideologies. Looking at world developments, Iggy bemoaned the tendency of the right to crush the left, notably in fascist Italy. This he likened to fighting poison with poison. The right might win in Europe, but he warned that there was as much to fear from the antidote as from the poison. Fortunately, concluded Iggy sarcastically, no one in Japan endorsed a fascist solution. Yeah, about that. While parties bemoaned government repression, the unions continued to steadily strengthen. By 1928, the number of unionized members had reached over 300,000, some 6.5% of all wage laborers. The Sodomei and their allied unions directed about half of these. The Domei and Hyogikai 25,000 and 36,000 respectively. Yet not all was well in this area either. The Kensekai's Union Bill, which had been described as universal suffrage for the industry, had fallen flat as the different bureaus fought over its contents. On one hand of this conflict was the more reformist social and home bureaus, and on the other side, the Conservative Justice Bureau and the Agriculture and Commerce Bureau. Oh boy. The Japanese government bureaus, what to say? If bureaucracy can be extremely hard to figure out elsewhere, the sprinkle of autonomy in the Japanese makes it all the worse. Independence meant that the bureaus had significant impact on Japanese interwar policy. Minor officials in the social and home ministries, such as Yasui Eiji and Goto Fumio, would have a massive impact on social reform in Japan, as these new men, as they were known, lay forward several proposals that often drew inspiration from the liberal West. Furthermore, independence meant that the different bureaus jockeyed over control of the police to implement their own interpretations of new and old laws alike. However, one quick side note, it should not be inferred that the bureaucrats in the Home and Social Ministry were progressive ideologically, simply reformists, and their main goal was stability, drawing inspiration from what was vogue and seemed to work, which in the 20s meant Anglo-American ideas, but in the 30s meant other nations, well exemplified by Goto Fumio, who, when Home Minister in the late 30s, heavily drew upon Nazi Germany for Japan's new labor policy. So, the 1920s had been an astonishing success for the labor movement. Yes, there were still wrinkles to iron out, but they had more than tripled their membership. The future, however, would not be so kind. In 1929, the Great Depression hit the world. In Japan, rural areas were devastated as prices plummeted. Industry too was hit hard, especially the small and medium factories which housed most of the unions. Unemployment skyrocketed. Government figures stated 300,000 out of work by December 1930. The true number, though, was most likely almost 7 to 9 times larger, at 2.4 or 3.1 million workers. While at first there was potential for the labor movement as the economic catastrophe led to a marked increase in labor disputes. 2,400 different disputes occurred with 150,000 workers partaking in 1930 alone. These at first independent strikes resulted in a new surge in union membership, reaching about 8% of the workforce, or 370,000 members in 818 different unions. But where the radical left saw an opportunity to rally the people and finally upend the system, the Social Democrats instead sought to compromise with the state to alleviate the depression and hinder a reactionary explosion of anti-socialism. Something that was occurring parallel to the Depression, with right-wing movements surging and spreading to the workplaces. Soon right-wing labor organizations such as the Nihon Sangyo Rodo Kurab, Japan Industrial Club, and Aikoku Rodo Komiai Senkoku Kondankai, All Japan Roundtable of Patriotic Labor Unions, was formed, increasing to a sizable 130,000 members by mid-1930. In an attempt to counter this right-wing movement, the Sodomate slowly but surely began distancing themselves from socialism and began fostering the idea of sound unionism to entice nationalist workers. And by doing so, beginning the reversal of their more than decade-long ideological support of socialism slowly back to the pre-1918 goal of harmony in the workplace. In the Diet, the left had fared no better, as the 1930 election was devastating as they lost 3 out of their 8 seats. Not all was terrible though, as the liberal Minseto had gained a majority and finally tried to implement their promised union bill the following year, which, while watered down from the left's vision, was still groundbreaking. The bill smoothly cleared the lower house, but when it reached the House of Lords it was denied, with great displeasure from the left. Had the Labour bill passed, what could have been is something that Andrew Gordon discusses. He writes, quote, "If the government had passed a union bill, the effect might have been comparable to that of the Wagner Act of 1937 in the United States. In the years after American unions first gained legal protection, unions increased their membership from just 13% of the non-agricultural workforce in 1935 to 29% in 1939. The Japanese unions had enrolled 7.9% on the eve of the final push for a union bill in 1931. If the bill had succeeded, it might have generated comparable enthusiasm for unions, and a surge of union building would have resulted. Of course, the bill failed. Even if unions had been granted legal protection in 1931, they surely would have rallied around the flag in the foreign policy crisis of 1931 to 32. That so-called foreign policy crisis was the Manchurian incident of 1931 and would be the decisive moment for the labor and socialist movement in interwar Japan. The imperialist conquest, for that is what it was, of Manchuria and the resulting international condemnation forced both movements to choose if they were to oppose the invasion and be persecuted or support it and abandon core part of the ideologies. Both decided to support it, but in different ways. The Social Democrats supported the invasion as a way to oppose what they saw as a reactionary regime of nationalist Chiang Kai-shek and the freedom of the Manchurian people. The Sodomei went further, choosing to continue down the path of sound unionism, attempting to instead seek collective agreements at workplaces to avert strikes. Soon, the complete disavowal of socialism finally occurred when Suzuki Bunji left the reins of the Sodomei to Matsuoka in late 31. If 1931 was bad, the following year was catastrophic and the beginning of the end for both movements. On May 15, 1932, extreme nationalist members of the military attempted a coup, and while they managed to assassinate Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi, the coup itself was a failure. Yet as a consequence, the attempt succeeded in removing civilian control of the government as it fell under the control of a less radical faction in the military, who promised to bring stability. The new government began stamping out volatile right-wing movements, but soon also began putting increasing pressure on left-wing and labor organizations. For example, as Sheldon Garon mentions, quote, "The Home Ministry became so committed to preventing strikes that most of the mediated disputes were again settled by ordinary police officers rather than professional conciliation officers. Official conciliation was often heavy-handed, to say the least. By 1935, mediators intervened without any formal request from either interested party in 75% of all conciliated settlements. Japanese scholars have appropriately called such practices saber mediation. In an attempt to counter the right and to improve from their failure to grow in the 1932 elections, the Social Democrats and the Nihon Ronoto finally agreed to merge into one single socialist party, the Shakai Taishō, or Social Masses Party, with Abe Iso and Asao Hisashi as the two most prominent figures, and a range of others such as Takao Iwasaburo, Suzuki Bunji, and Nishio Suihiro also steering the ship. At first, this appeared to be quite the apt decision from the left. In the 1936 and 37 elections, the party will win 18 and a whopping 37 seats respectively. But there was a latent danger in this union. Asao Hisashi began flirting with the idea of a unified military all-party dictatorship to achieve socialist policy, and would incrementally move toward Japanism, a Japanese form of National Socialism. For example, in 1934, Asao Hisashi wrote of an alliance consecrated by the emperor who embodied the spiritual faith of the race between the proletarian forces and the anti-capitalist reformist military. Yeah, some cognitive dissonance there to be sure to believe that the military was an ally. During the formation of the Shakai Taishō, the Sodomei and Domei merged in January 1936 to form the Sen Nihon Rodo Sodomei, All Japan General Federation of Labor, with a total of 90,000 members out of the total nationwide 420,000 union members. But the new organization was a mess of conflicting ideas pulled in two different directions between sound unionism and anti-capitalism. While the labor movement and its socialist counterpart had been allowed in the periphery, as 1936 progressed, however, the hammer of government repression began crashing down as the government disallowed the unions in the military arsenals, some of the biggest Sodomei unions, 15,000 strong, on behalf of the War Ministry to ensure that they were stable in wartime. The practice of sound unions had therefore not kept the Sodomei safe. It had seemed the government still saw them as a potential threat, and as Stephen Lard so aptly put it, quote, "Like men rudely awakened from deep sleep, the Shaminke, social democratic, labor leaders in the Sodomei were jarred by the insurrection in 32, and its aftermath of repression into the realization that because the new threats to the labor movement were essentially political, a political response was required to stave off the threats and save the unions. Which by this point was impossible, as the government had no inclination whatsoever to allow that by this point. Still, the Sodomate tried, allying once again with the Shakai Taishō, partially contributing to the 1937 election success. 2 months after this election, however, all this was for naught, with the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. This Holy War, as it was called, changed everything. Not only did the state further increase its control at all levels of society, the labor organizations fervently hopped aboard the war train with patriotic outpourings and the complete reversal of the anti-fascist and anti-militarism slogans of the past year. The same occurred within the Shakai Taishō. The state, however, was not finished in its actions to further reduce all possible threats, no matter how small, and inspired by Nazi Germany, the state formed the SAMPO, Industrial Patriotic Societies, in 1938. A policy that publicly was stated to harmonize workplace relations and where both unions and management had a place, but was in reality made to take control of both the labor and business side of the workplace. But just like in Germany, the SAMPO still favored the corporations over the workers. This policy thus decimated the labor organizations, as they, often by their own volition, hemorrhaged unions and members into the SAMPO. Those who did not dissolve voluntarily were harangued by the government to do so swiftly. Union membership began dipping, declining in the following year to 360,000 and plunging to a measly 9,455 in 1940. The idea of dissolving the political parties into a joint government also floated around, and Asao Hisashi and his faction in both the Shakai Taishō and the Sodomei was all for it, having the parties join the joint wartime government under Prime Minister Konoe, and the labor side join the Sampo. Hisashi's plea created a split in the Sodomei in July 1939 between those who supported the government but rejected the idea of dissolving and those who went the full way, and they soon went ahead dissolving unions supporting Hisashi. In a stunning reversal, it was therefore the remaining part of the Sodomei who was now accused of being a communist ally by those who had once been further to the left. Simultaneously, while the Shakai Taishō remained intact for a while longer, in 1940 it too split over the issue of the ousting of a liberal Minseto from the Diet for speaking out against the failure to win the war in China. When the Social Democratic faction of Abe Iso did not vote in support of the ousting, Asao Hisashi's faction did. Hisashi, therefore, then used his power in the Shakai Taishō to expose all those who, beside Abe, had not voted for the motion, and so they were. Abe himself soon left in protest, and Hisashi was swiftly elected chairman of the party, at which the party would dissolve on the 3rd of July 1940. Any attempt by the Sodomei and the now expelled members of the Shakai Taishō to form a new party was shot down by the government before they even came into fruition. The government would simply not have it anymore. All that remained was now the Sodomei, and Matsuoka, its chairman, when told to dissolve by close associates of his in order to show his patriotism, replied, quote, "I cannot agree to dissolve the Sodomei. If the government liquidates the Sodomei, so be it, but I am far from participating exclusively in Sampo. We might win this war, but we might lose it. After the war, it may be useful for me to have taken this position." To which one associate said, "Well, Matsuoka, my friend, do not worry. Losing the war is an impossibility." However, on the 21st of July 1940, with factory and capitalist organizations, political parties on the left and the right, dissolving one after the others, the Sodomei knew it was the end of the road for them. Its numbers fell daily and the state grew ever impatient and hostile. And so, the last major labor force in the country dissolved, after 28 long years of actively trying to create unions. From the humble origins of the rice rights in 1918, the interwar period had allowed the socialist and labor movement through thick and thin to become a significant part of Japanese society. And while many of their hopes and dreams failed or was destroyed, it was ingrained into the mentality of the Japanese worker and would reappear once the war was over with new vigor. There is an important lesson to be drawn from the actions of the Sodomei and the Shakai Taishō, which is illuminated by comparing it to then contemporary international politics in Europe. Just like how Chamberlain in Britain thought he could understand and work together with Hitler to find peace in Europe by appeasing him, So did the left in Japan think that they could partner with the state by watering down their own politics. The result was catastrophic for both, and clearly highlights that when combating authoritarian movements, appeasement of ideals only serves their purpose and simply drags out the inevitable attempted destruction. And while Britain was saved that annihilation by the sea, no such division was there to save the Sodomei and the Shakai Minshuto from the wrath of the fascist state. This, however, would not be the end of the Japanese labor and socialist movement, for just as it was with the British, the Americans would appear and turn the tide. Thanks for watching this video. It was fun to make, took a long time. I hope you come back and enjoy more.